Macbeth, the plot. It consists of 5 key things, that being the exposition, rising action, the climax, the falling action, the resolution and denouement. So this is your basic plot structure. This is the plot structure you will apply to all types of literature, plays, novels, short stories. And so the basic plot structure starts with exposition. This is the introduction. This is how we get introduced to the story, to the characters, to the setting. And so obviously, not all of your characters are going to be introduced all at once. Some stories may do it that way, others won't. And the setting may change throughout the play or throughout the novel, and that's fine. But we are introduced to the main things that we need to know. And so the question should be, why has the writer decided to make these characters, this setting, this situation, the first thing we are exposed to? And we also see here what the daily life is like for the characters in this play, what the status quo is for these characters. And so now, going from exposition all the way into rising action, we have the inciting incident. This is the event that kicks everything off, that starts the story, that begins the protagonist's journey. Very often the protagonist is faced with the enemy or some sort of conflict, or they learn something about themselves or someone else. Then within this rising action, you have various types of conflict. This can be inner conflict, it can be external conflict, it can be conflict with society, with nature, with supernatural elements. And within these conflicts and these events happening in rising action, we see the stakes of what the protagonist could win, what the protagonist could lose. We see the different aspects of their life. We see whether they strive after wealth or love or money or career or whatever it is that they strive after, and we see what they stand to lose in this rising action. And the rising action builds and builds and builds all the way to the climax. And this is the turning point. This is where things change drastically. This is a moment of tension for the audience, for the characters. This is when the battle is won or the battle is lost. This is when there's resolution to conflict, where something happens that changes the whole play, and we can now start going towards the end. And as we start going towards the end, we have falling action. Now, this is the aftermath, the results, the consequences of the event that happened in the climax. And this is the character reactions to the climax. This is mysteries that are solved, loose threads that are tied up. There could still be conflicts that take place in the falling action that will allow for the end result to take place. And the falling action really prepares the reader for the end of this play or novel. And after that, we get to the resolution and the denouement. This is when the problem or the conflict is resolved. Sometimes not. If the author decides that they want the problem to just continue open-ended, hanging there, that's fine. The enemy is usually vanquished, the goal is reached, and there is now a new normal for the characters, for the setting, for everybody involved in the story. So if we look at the exposition of Macbeth, we see first of all the setting is Scotland. We know that it is set in Scotland, and the setting that we are first introduced to is the open battleground outside, where Macbeth and his comrades are fighting against the Irish. And so a good question to ask here is, why has Shakespeare chosen to open up this play on a battleground? What is so significant about that? The characters that are introduced in the exposition are Macbeth, the witches, the sergeant telling of Macbeth's heroic deeds. Why would Shakespeare have someone talking about how heroic and wonderful Macbeth is? We have the situation that we're exposed to here, which is that Macbeth is considered a war hero and that he fights and defeats the king's enemy. He is loyal to his king. The inciting incident is after Macbeth has heard the witch's prophecy, where he finds out he's going to be Thane of Cawdor and then king. When he now finds out that he has been named Thane of Cawdor, this is what starts his ambition. This is what gets the ball rolling in his thoughts of becoming king. The rising action that we see here, the second event after the inciting incident, is when Malcolm is named Duncan's successor. And why is this important? It's important because Macbeth was told he would be king. Now there's someone else that's being told they'll be king, and this gets Macbeth's thoughts rolling of what he should do. The third event is when Macbeth murders Duncan. The fourth event is when Macbeth is now named King of Scotland. And the fifth event is where he plots to kill Banquo. Now the climax is, like I said, the turning point. It's the moment when everything changes. And the climax here is when Macbeth has Banquo murdered. And the lords have a conversation where they start to see through Macbeth's lies. Fleance's escape is also a major part of this climax because Banquo's dying words ordering Fleance to get revenge for this killing reminds the audience of the prophecy that Banquo will not be king, and we see that now because he's been killed, he is the father of a line to kings. His children will be kings, and Fleance escapes. He does not die. And so it is a turning point. It is also a turning point because here we see that Macbeth's morals are completely gone. He has decided to kill one of his closest friends simply because he's a threat to the throne. So the sixth event now in the falling action going to the end is when Macduff's family is killed. The seventh event is when the Scottish forces plan to attack Dunsinane Castle. The eighth event is Lady Macbeth's suicide. Her suicide is a very critical event. And the ninth event is when Macbeth fights Siward and kills him. Now the resolution and the denouement. The denouement is the final battle when Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane. Macbeth fights Macduff, Macduff kills Macbeth, and Macbeth's death means that there is now peace for Scotland. And the resolution is Macbeth is killed, Malcolm is crowned king, Scotland is at peace once more, and the rightful king is on the throne. So if we look at the tragedy, Macbeth is a Shakespearean tragedy, and if you remember from grade 9 English when we did Romeo and Juliet, which is also a very famous Shakespearean tragedy, there are elements within Shakespearean tragedy that make it the genre that it is. Aristotle defines tragedy as the imitation of an action that is serious and also as having magnitude complete in itself, in appropriate and pleasurable language, in a dramatic rather than narrative form, with incidents arousing pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish a catharsis of these emotions. The Webster Dictionary defines tragedy as a serious play or drama, typically dealing with the problems of a central character, leading to an unhappy or disastrous ending brought on, as in ancient drama, by fate and a tragic flaw in this character, or, in modern drama, usually by moral weakness, psychological maladjustment, or social pressures. This is a really good essay question in that I can give you this definition and ask you to explain how Macbeth is a tragedy in accordance with this definition. So now let's look at the elements of a Shakespearean tragedy. So number one, we have the tragic hero. Now Macbeth is considered the tragic hero in this play, and that's also another beautiful essay question of should he be considered the tragic hero. So within the tragic hero, you have a suffering that is due to a character flaw. So Macbeth's character flaw is his unchecked ambition and greed, which leads to suffering and his eventual death, which leads us to the second point of inevitable death. And so Macbeth will die at the end of this play due to the tragedy elements. So a tragic hero usually is one of an elite and high position, and Macbeth is a famed and respected general in Duncan's army. He holds an elite and high position in Scotland. And the death causes a disturbance. Now in this case, Macbeth's death causes a disturbance in that Shakespeare, Scotland is once again at peace. That is the disturbance, that the turmoil has been disturbed. The second element is Hamartia. This is a fatal flaw. It comes from the Greek word and it means to err, to miss the mark, sin or error. And the Hamartia brings about suffering and death. And so Macbeth's Hamartia, again, is his unchecked ambition and his greed. Third element is good versus evil. Now there is a supremacy of evil and a suppression of good. Now, the main character is usually tasked to defeat evil, but they fail. And we see this in Macbeth. Macbeth has the power to overcome his Hamartia, but he doesn't. Evil is usually disguised, and so we see that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are not suspected until much later in the play. Evil is presented as ever-enduring. Under Macbeth's reign, Scotland faces seemingly endless turmoil. There's people in Scotland, the other lords think that this turmoil will never end. Now, evil typically conquers goodness, and so we see that Macbeth conquered goodness when killing Duncan, because Duncan was a good king, but the order is restored when Macbeth is killed and goodness is returned to Scotland. In the Shakespeare tragedy, there is always tragic waste. This is meaningless death, senseless death, and very often the hero dies with the opponent. So Macbeth dies alongside Duncan, maybe not immediately, but eventually Macbeth does die. And if we want to look a little bit deeper, we can say that Macbeth's moral compass, Macbeth's ethics, Macbeth's emotional well-being dies the moment that he kills Duncan. And we see that Macduff remains alive after killing Macbeth. And so Macduff is the good that survives when the evil is killed. And now the death of the tragic hero is not an ordinary loss. It is a loss, but it is not ordinary. And so we see Duncan's death is the loss of peace, whereas Macbeth's death is a restoration of peace. And so both both of those deaths are not ordinary in what they did to Scotland. And we see that good is destroyed with evil, and this is part of the tragic waste. And we see Duncan was destroyed with evil, Banquo was destroyed with evil, and Macduff's family was destroyed with evil. So we see also a lack of poetic justice in the Shakespearean tragedy. This is the lack of a fitting and just end. Poetic justice means that good is rewarded and evil is punished, but in Shakespeare's plays we don't often see that, especially in the tragedies. What we see is a partial justice, just a little bit of justice coming through. And so we see that Macbeth actually contains a lot more poetic justice than other tragedies, in that both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth die and order is restored. Usually with the lack of poetic justice, evil is rewarded and good is punished. And we see Macbeth becoming king after killing Duncan is a moment where evil is rewarded and good is punished. And when Macduff's family is killed, that is when evil is rewarded and good is punished. And obviously the meaningless death as well. So we see tragic waste and lack of poetic justice fit in together. We see a lot of external conflict in a Shakespearean tragedy, and that's conflict between characters. And so we see here that we have tons of conflicts here. Macbeth fights and kills the king's enemies. Lady Macbeth insults Macbeth. Macbeth kills Duncan. Macbeth has Banquo killed. Macbeth has Macduff's family killed. The battle at Dunsinane. Macbeth fights and kills Seward. Macbeth and Macduff fight, and Macduff kills Macbeth. There is also internal conflict that happens in the characters' minds. It's conflict in their mind, it's confusion, and very often the tragic hero is faced with a critical dilemma. And we see Macbeth is faced with dilemmas left, right, and center and always chooses the wrong option. So we see here Macbeth's thoughts after the first prophecy when he hears he's going to be king and the internal conflict happening there. Macbeth's struggle to kill Duncan, as well as Lady Macbeth's struggle to go through with having Duncan killed. Macbeth's hallucinations, there where he says in Act 3, Scene 2, "Oh, full of scorpions is my mind." Beautiful quote to prove that there is internal conflict. We see Lady Macbeth's inner turmoil and eventual suicide, there where she's washing her hands saying, "Out, damn spot, out," I say, in Act 5, trying to get this hallucination of the blood off her hands and this inner conflict. And then we also see Macduff's turmoil when his family is killed and how he feels that it was his fault that his family was killed and that he left them in the lurch. We also see a catharsis in Shakespearean tragedy. This is a release of emotions. And so within the play, there are events that happen that cause emotional tension in the audience and cause emotions in the audience. And when the resolution happens or when certain things happen, there is a cleansing of this pent-up emotions within the audience. This is also the audience's personal relation to characters, how they relate to characters, whether they hate certain characters, dislike them, like them, really the audience's personal relation to all the characters and even events in the play. So we see the supernatural elements here. Now, if you remember the introduction to Shakespeare presentation, you saw that the Elizabethans were quite superstitious and that they did believe in these supernatural elements. And the supernatural elements really create an atmosphere of awe and mystery. And we see this when the witches arrive on the battlefield and in the other scenes where they are. There's really this really crazy atmosphere in those scenes, and also when we see Banquo's ghost at the feast. It's also used to advance the plot, and so the prophecy drives Macbeth's ambitions and drives his actions, and the hallucinations are what lead to Lady Macbeth's suicide. In the tragedy, it doesn't seem like we should have comic relief, but we do. These are humorous moments that relieve the tension and lighten the mood, and so the porter in Act 2 is really wonderful example of comic relief, as well as Macbeth's behavior at the feast, although it is darker comedy. Let's look at some essay questions that could come from this section of Macbeth. The first is to discuss whether Macbeth can be considered a Shakespearean tragedy. Make specific reference to examples and quotes from the play. Here you would really need to understand and know what the Shakespearean tragedy elements are, as well as know the play really well in order to link the two together and explain why Macbeth can be considered a Shakespearean tragedy. Discuss whether Macbeth can be considered a tragic hero. Make specific reference to examples and quotes from the play. Here again, you would have to know the specific elements of what makes a tragic hero, as well as really understand the character of Macbeth and link the two together to make a good essay explaining whether he deserves to be considered a tragic hero or not.